which founder educated not one, but two future presidents of the United States in the ways of law? Oh, and he also happened to educate a Chief Justice of the United States as well. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is George Wythe. George Wythe is an extraordinarily important founder. He was early into the revolutionary movement. There's so much to say about his life, but I don't want to make this video too long. So in brief, he was early supporter of the American Revolution, had been in Virginia's House of Burgesses for almost 30 years by the time the Revolution began. He went to the Second Continental Congress and voted for the Declaration of Independence, but left before it was signed. He would do a lot with Virginia, building Virginia, and then would go to the Constitutional Convention and be important in crafting the Constitution, and then leave before it's signed. And then he would actually be the chairman of the Committee of Whole for the Virginia Ratification Convention. And I've spoken about chairman of the Committee of the Whole in other videos. It was a parliamentary procedure where essentially the president of the convention would step down and Wythe would step up, and they'd hash things out and come to an agreement, and then he'd step down, and then Edmund Pendleton, who was the president of the Ratification Convention, would step back up, and then you vote officially. So Wythe gave an impassioned speech right at the end of the convention that swayed many voters to favor the new Constitution. And in fact, Virginia, out of 168 votes, only passed it by 10 votes. And a lot of people credit George Wythe's impassioned speech. Now, Wythe would go on back to private life and live a much longer private life from there. But what's really interesting about George Wythe is two things. First of all, who he taught his students, and his death. So, about his students, when he was in his mid-30s, he took on a young law student who was a teenager, whose name you might recognize, Thomas Jefferson. And George Wythe taught Thomas Jefferson the law, and Jefferson himself would have quite the impact on the United States. Furthermore, he would teach James Monroe, who would also be a president of the United States. He would also educate John Marshall, who was Chief Justice of the United States for quite a while in the early 1800s and is probably the most important Chief Justice of all time. He also taught Bushrod Washington, who's lesser known but was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court with John Marshall that whole time and had almost as big an impact working with John Marshall and agreeing with him on almost everything they voted on. There were several other people, St. George Tucker, who would later basically replace Wythe as the law professor at College of William and Mary. Henry Clay, John Breckinridge, Spencer Roane, Littleton Waller Tazewell would all be important in the second generation of American leaders. I do want to note, before we talk about his death, George Wythe actually is one of the few Southerners who liberated all of his slaves during his lifetime. He saw the contradiction between the freedom they were preaching and the slavery they had, and he freed all his slaves during his lifetime, and many of whom decided to continue work in his house for him. And that comes into play when we talk about his death, and I will make this very brief, but when George Wythe was 79, he had a grandnephew come live with him, a namesake, George Wythe Sweeney. George Wythe Sweeney was his sister's grandson. Came to live with Wythe, took care of him. The kid was a gambler, not a great guy, had tried to forge some of George Wythe's checks in the past, and one day, Wythe and two of his guests don't feel so good, and they get really ill, and one of them dies pretty quickly. The other one would go on to recover, but Wythe was ill for about a week and a half, and he immediately said, "I think I was poisoned by George Wythe Sweeney." Well, we can't really prove either way. The autopsy wasn't done so well, but he died, like, he signed his will and changed his inheritance so this kid didn't get any as he was dying. And then, when he did pass away, there were certain black people who worked in his house, former slaves that he had liberated, come back to work for him, who said they saw this kid put a white powder in the morning coffee. But because of laws that, interestingly, George Wythe wrote with Thomas Jefferson during the Revolution when they revised Virginia's laws. Because of a law Wythe wrote, black people couldn't testify in court. So his killer seems to have gone free, alleged killer, seems to have gone free because of a law he had written mistakenly a long time ago. They revised the laws, he didn't unrevise that. There was also an issue, I'm sorry, they didn't write that law, they just didn't change it. Another law they changed was about forged checks, where you can't forge a check to an individual, but they never wrote that you couldn't forge a check to a bank. And the gentleman was caught trying to forge one of Wythe's checks, but got away with it because he was forging it to the bank and not to Wythe. So, an amazingly important founder with an unbelievable impact on the United States we live in today, who has this weird scandal at the end of his life. So that's the story of George Wythe. I hope I piqued your interest to look into him, because I left out so much today, and this is already one of my longer videos recently. So definitely check out George Wythe. Please hit like if you enjoyed this, and if you're new here, hit subscribe. I talk about random founders 5 days a week. Not usually this long, but again, Wythe's got a lot to say. Thank you so much, and thank you especially to my patrons who help make this channel possible. If you're interested in supporting me, check out the link below, and I will be back on Monday with another founder.